now my pleasure to turn the webinar over to our speaker, Richard Curtis. Rick, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. Well, good morning, everyone. What we're going to try to cover today, we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of culture in establishing an ongoing either survey readiness program, regulatory compliance program, some of the obstacles that occur in trying to do this, and then most importantly, some strategies, real world type strategies that you can use to try to inculcate a culture into the fabric of the organization. Sorry about the pounding. I have some construction going on. One of the joys of working virtually, I just asked the gentleman to stop for a bit. All right. I start my programs always with this particular slide, and it talks about that quality pyramid, or in this case, a pyramid around regulatory compliance and quality. And if you look at the top of that pyramid, it's everything that we do to try to excel in providing care, treatment, and service, to always try to be the best that we can be recognized both internally and externally by folks for the excellent care we provide, and then to continuously improve that care. And that's usually the focus of a hospital's QAPI program, the attention of senior leadership, where resources are expended, etc. But it's at the base of that pyramid that where culture is actually formed. And it's around the assurance and control of simple quality measures, very unexciting things like documentation of care, making sure that quality control activities, let's say related to disinfection or sterilization, are performed. Something as simple as making sure that your crash carts are checked and your refrigerator temperatures are monitored, H&Ps are done in a timely manner, orders are complete, whatever it might be. It's all the stuff that we do on a day in, day out basis that forms the base of that pyramid around, again, that control and assurance of quality, and obviously the safety of patients and the environment. Why is culture important here? Because if you do not have a culture that embraces a sustainable regulatory compliance program, eventually the pyramid will start to crumble. Our attention and focus is on the top of the pyramid, and the analogy I would give you is if you've ever walked into a home and it is beautifully furnished and wonderfully decorated, and then all of a sudden, an inspector goes, yeah, but your foundation's eroding, your plumbing is cracked, your electrical is not been maintained appropriately. You look great, but you got some real problems in terms of how well your house has been formed and has been maintained. Essentially, if we don't have the culture to support a regulatory compliance program, in most cases, hospitals will eventually erode that base of the pyramid and be akin to that house that looks good but has some really fundamental problems. So what do you need to do? I mean, how do you go about establishing a culture of quality and safety? I'm going to tell you that when I do this presentation, I'm not really into a lot of abstract theoretical concepts. It really is designed to be some practical, real-world stuff that hopefully you can take back to your organizations and have work for you. First off, I will tell you that trying to establish a culture is not easy. It takes anywhere from 18 to 36 months and up to 5 years at times to actually create a culture. And over the past 20 years, the failure rate by institutions, including hospitals and others, has been approximately 70%, and it really hasn't changed much. Something that's really interesting is that sometimes we have an attitude that culture is established and maintained from top down. So the CEO and the C-suite and the leadership of the organization, if they embrace the culture and they can micromanage the culture, then essentially the culture itself will permeate throughout the organization, especially in small hospitals, rural hospitals, small community hospitals, where there's not a lot of bureaucracy and layers of management. If, quite honestly, if you do have a CEO and some senior leaders that really establish certain behaviors, you can micromanage that. The problem, though, is that the average tenure of a CEO across the board for hospitals is just a little over 5 years, a median about 3.6. And if it can take up to 5 years to establish a culture, how can you rely on a person or a couple of people to be the drivers throughout the organization when statistically, at least, they may not be there long enough to actually get that culture formed to begin with? So there's an argument to be made that to have a successful culture, you've got to move it beyond people and into processes. We asked, a long time ago, we asked somebody at my old hospital before I went to the dark side and became a surveyor, what does culture mean? What is organizational culture? And I have to put my kind of consultant hat on now. Culture is a synergistic alignment of attributes reflecting the normative expression of behaviors transcending individual bias, thoughts, and secondary determinants. And we all kind of looked at them, scratched our head, and promptly fired the consultant because that was meaningless. So then I did a literature search. And the textbooks basically say organizational culture is made up, and this is important, shared values, beliefs, and assumptions about how people should behave and interact. And that's actually a pretty good definition, but it doesn't really have an oomph to it. And how do you do that simply in a way that everybody down to the line staff would understand it? So I came up with this one, and with apologies to KISS, organizational culture is what your staff does when no one is looking. And I want to say that again and let that thing sink in. Organizational culture is what your staff does when you're not watching them. And that is a real key. If you've ever heard of something called the Hawthorne effect, you'll understand what I'm saying. For those of you that may not have a background in performance improvement, the Hawthorne effect essentially is a concept that was developed back in 1958 by a fellow named Henry Landsberger. And he was studying essentially some work that had been done at the Hawthorne factory, which was an electric factory just outside of Chicago. And they had done multiple studies on essentially employee behavior. And what Landsberger recognized was that when the employees were being watched by their supervisor, when they knew that someone was paying attention to what they were doing, their work product, their accuracy, their effort, their error rates, everything was very different from when the employees surmised that no one was watching them. And he coined this phase, this observation to a phrase called the Hawthorne effect. Essentially, that which is monitored improves. So yes, in a small rural hospital, you would have the ability, if it's done correctly, to basically watch everything that's going on. And by virtue of the fact that you were monitoring things, you would see a level of improvement that would be higher than if you weren't. The problem, though, is that to do that is very resource intensive and, quite frankly, doesn't hold water over the long haul, even for a small rural hospital. At some point, you have to bank on your staff, your line people, to do what they're supposed to do correctly without being observed, and do it right 100% of the time. So that's where culture comes in. Hawthorne effect is essentially the antithesis of culture. If you have a Hawthorne effect, you don't have a culture. If you have a culture, you don't need a Hawthorne effect. That's basically how this works. So how do you establish the culture? First piece is you got to engage your people. what's their individual commitment and connection to the organization. If you haven't engaged your folks, it's awfully hard to get them to buy in to the processes you put in place to establish and maintain that culture. Simply put, are folks checked in or are they checked out? Engagement actually is not very easy to do. And back in 2017, Gallup did a study in industries across the spectrum, not just hospitals or healthcare, and asked folks how engaged were they in their jobs. About a third said that they felt they were highly engaged, they were actively engaged. Half said, I basically show up, do what I'm told to do or what I'm required to do. I don't really put in any extra effort, don't really put in any more work than that. I just basically punch my clock. And then almost a little over 15% actually said that they were actively disengaged. That not only did they just show up, but actually they showed up and consciously tried to do the bare minimum, just enough to get by without getting in too much trouble. So then similar studies, by coincidence, the same year, Dale Carnegie's group went out and they asked leaders, how important is engagement to you? And about a little over a fourth of the leaders said that it's very important. We think about it, we talk about it, we plan for it. A little less than 45% said, yeah, we work on it frequently, but yet over almost a third said that it's rare or if ever that they really put any time, focus, or effort into culture. So if you think about it, if a third of the leaders in organizations basically check out of this, and almost 69% are either a staff or either actively disengaged or just going through the motions, is it any wonder that culture struggles to maintain itself and sustain itself over time? So engagement really is a key to that very first step of establishing culture. One of the things to recognize is that you can't write a policy that says you will have a good culture, you will behave a certain way, you will act in a certain manner. Culture is a soft sell. It's an adaptive work. It's not a technical work. And one of the mistakes we make often in hospitals or any other institution is that we think if we put something structurally in technical work, that somehow that solves the problem. So we write policies and we have standardized procedures and we develop protocols and we do checklists, all the tools that people need to do their jobs well, to understand them. But if we don't also then apply what they call adaptive work, which are the values, the attitudes, and the beliefs that someone has to have, is it any wonder that when we get surveyed, or the state comes in or your accreditor comes in, that you go, I don't know how we got, we had all the right tools, we had all the right policies. How come they weren't used? How come the staff didn't abide by them? That's the difference between an engagement that understands the importance of adaptive modeling versus technical work. So how do you promote engagement? There's 4 pillars, and we're going to go through these fairly briefly. The first is trust. If staff, physicians don't trust the leadership of an organization and the motivation of that leadership, they will have a very difficult time being engaged. Obviously, they have to be motivated themselves, have the right attitude and aptitude, and then be given the opportunity. So what does trust mean? It's fairly straightforward, but it's not as simple as you might think. I love this particular line that you see on the screen, and I'll read it to you in case you don't see it easily. We trust people because they showed up when it wasn't convenient, because they told the truth when it was easier to lie, and because they kept a promise when they could have gotten away with breaking it. And I will share a story with you. Several years ago, I was invited to speak at a medical staff leadership retreat for a hospital. They were preparing for survey, and they wanted me to speak to the medical staff about their role in the survey process, the type of things that get looked at, how to prepare, etc. So while I was waiting for my turn to get up on the podium, I actually ran into a couple of docs that I hadn't seen in a while that I used to work with. So it was kind of like an old homecoming week, and I ended up sitting with them, and we're chatting, during breaks and stuff. And their corporate quality director got up before me and started talking about all the strategic objectives and all the things that the corporation was going to do to support the hospital and to improve the care. And they wanted the physicians' feedback, and they wanted them to know all this stuff. And I was watching the room, and you could see the sheer apathy throughout everybody. And the docs just sat there with a blank look on their face, no reaction at all. And I turned to one of my friends, who was an internist, and I said, "Hey, you guys got a bad vibe in here." And he goes, "Oh, we've heard this before. This is the third time they've said all this stuff. They promise everything, nothing ever happens. We just sit here and wait for lunch." That's a problem when you can't build that sense of trust, because the behaviors transcended the words. And all of us know actions speak louder than words. So you build trust by being a model, part of the team, transparent, don't micromanage, don't overpromise, rather over-deliver. That's a little key when you are working with stakeholders, be it physician, staff, community. Rather than over-promising and promising the world, under-promise, and then when you over-deliver, people will think that you're brilliant and they'll love what you did. And most importantly, it's the follow-through. And I'll give you a concrete example of this. Even in a small organization, you have committees, you have meetings, you make decisions, you ask for additional information. Essentially, you create action items through the structure of the organization for things that still need to get done, etc. The ability to show a follow-through by tracking those actions is fundamental to, one, showing that to your organization you're not dropping the ball, things don't fall through the cracks, you are keeping an eye, and you promise to do what you said you were going to do, which was to follow up on something. And setting up a tracking system in your minutes to track action items by some unique identifier that then carries over from one meeting to the next, etc., until it is resolved. Not only can a surveyor like me come in and go, "Hey, I can see where this came up through the organization, went up through QAPI, got cleared to the governing body wanted additional information, and I can track the whole thing to resolution by a unique identifier that was attached to that issue." I can do that, but more importantly, your own organization can do that. So consider that a way of showing that things don't get dropped through. There is follow-through. Follow-through doesn't mean you always do what they want. It's that you followed through and came back and said, "We can't do this, and here's the reason why." At least they know that you are following through. Statistics. Be careful with your statistics. A fellow by the name of Benjamin Disraeli said there's three types of lies: lies, damned lies, and statistics. People act on data, especially your physicians. And if you do not present data that is fundamentally accurate, then you've lost all trust and credibility with your organization. And unfortunately, we have a tendency to be somewhat, in many cases, somewhat laissez-faire with how we collect data and how we assure its inter-rater reliability and its accuracy. And the worst thing you can have happen is you present something that paints a picture and people poke holes in it because the data is not accurate and wasn't vetted, etc. Motivation. If you remember, if you ever went through your university or college, probably took a course on psychology, and in that course, one of the first things they taught you was Maslow's motivation hierarchy. And if you remember this, if you think about what motivates people, there's 4 basic levels. Do you have your basic needs met, your psychological needs, and then the needs around self-fulfillment? And Maslow's theory was that you can't progress up that pyramid until the rungs below you have been met. So if someone is homeless, is trying to scramble where their next meal's coming from, spending time and energy on self-esteem isn't going to be something that they're all kind of much interested in. I got far more important things to worry about. Where am I sleeping tonight? That's the concept behind Maslow. I think there's a correlation between that traditional quality pyramid and what motivates people. You can't get people motivated to the higher ends of improving and excelling in the quality of care and service rendered if you haven't provided that base that assures that things are working well, that things don't, processes are being maintained, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's that concept of firming up the base that allows you to then get to areas where you can spend time motivating individuals to become engaged and further reinforce that pyramid and work your way up the chain. So what motivates people? Basically, there's 3 things really: a belief in being part of something bigger, getting better at what they do. The more you do something, the better you get at it, and having some control and autonomy over choice and work. Folks that are intrinsically engaged will be your best champions. So if I'm driven myself to become engaged and be motivated, those are the ones that are likely to really push others to do so. So things to motivate, not motivate. The one thing I would recommend that we never do is, especially when it comes to regulation, is just say to someone you have to do it because the regulation says so. That is an absolute death knell to motivation. We have to find a way to take what is required of us by some external agency and find the rationale for why doing that would improve patient care, reduce risk, reduce liability for the practitioner, etc. We had there's an old requirement around back in the day of having to complete your verbal orders. If a doctor gave a verbal order, then they were supposed to come on and co-sign it, etc. And back in that day, there was a time frame where you had to do that. Nowadays, it depends on state law and your own policies. But back then, I think it was like you had 48 hours to do this, of course. So surveyors would come in, and there were, verbal orders all over the place that weren't countersigned. So hospitals would go to the medical staff and the MEC, and they go, we have to authenticate our verbal orders, and I have a little story coming up on that. And they try to write an action plan. But quite frankly, signing my orders isn't something that I found intrinsically valuable. And that's what multiple physicians said to me. I just don't see the reason for it. And if the response was, well, because CMS or our accreditor said so, well, that's about worth a quarter of a cup of coffee. But if the response was, let me share with you 4 cases where the physician's lack of authenticating a verbal order resulted in a missed opportunity to correct that order, and because of that missed opportunity, patients suffered an adverse effect. That makes it real. And now I see, okay, we need to do this not just because CMS or CIHQ or the Joint Commission said so. There's actually a rationale and a reason for why this helps to keep patients safe. And that type of thing will increase your motivation far more than simply saying that we have to do it because somebody told us to. Attitude and aptitude. I don't know if you can read this. It's George Bernard Shaw, but it's a great quote. It says, when a man teaches something he does not know to somebody else who has no aptitude for it and gives him a certificate of proficiency, the latter has completed the education of a gentleman. So if you don't know what you're doing, but you teach somebody else how to do it and you say, hey, you're great, that's probably what he was talking about gentlemen. So what's an attitude is how you think about something. Aptitude is your ability to do something. You could have the best of intentions, but you don't have the skill set for it. Conversely, you can have the skill set for it, but your attitude really prevents you from being successful in whatever you are endeavoring to do. So trying to find individuals with both the right attitude and aptitude to be your champions, to engage people in establishing a culture is absolutely critical. 3 quick stories about attitude gone wrong. Remember I told you about co-signing orders? I was sitting in a meeting of an MEC once at a community hospital. They had been surveyed by the Joint Commission. They got cited for not co-signing orders. Someone at the MEC raised their hand and said, I think this is a ridiculous waste of time. We're not going to do it. Tell CMS Joint Commission where to stick it. And I remember the CEO was sitting next to me, and he leans over and whispers, he goes, can they do that? And I said, well, it's their MEC. They can say whatever they want. And the medical staff secretary is going, should I write that down? And I said, no, I'd probably just leave that off the books until you had a chance to talk. But that's attitude. Second example, survey team. By the way, never have your surveyors go into the physician dining room for lunch. It can be a minefield in there. In this particular case, hospital sent folks in. Surveyor hears an anesthesiologist who spots them, says right out front, we should put a sign out that says, welcome Joint Commission, expletive deleted. Of course, the hospital administration apologized all over themselves. You know, this isn't how we are. This is horrible. We apologize. And the survey team was very kind. They said, we understand these things happen. And they sustained multiple condition level deficiencies right after that. This one was an actual, I witnessed this. I felt so sorry for this quality director. They had a survey done. They were given 57 requirements for improvement by the Joint Commission over a 3-day survey. The CEO at the exit conference goes, well, this isn't my problem. That's what I have a quality director for. Imagine how successful that QM director is going to be if that's the support and the attitude toward regulatory compliance from the leader of the organization. Now, just in case you think it's all us, trust me, it goes both ways. Years and years ago, I attended a survey that had the California Department of Health Services as part of the survey team. And at lunch, I noticed that the orientee was sitting off by herself, and I hate to see people eating lunch alone. So I walked over, sat and joined her. We started talking. I asked about, you know, why did she get into working for the Department of Health? This was her exact quote. I love this job. I don't have to think. And I sat there somewhat nonplussed, and I wasn't sure how to respond. So I basically just said, well, I'm sure you'll have a great career, and left it at that. So the attitude goes both ways, and aptitude as well. So how do you get the right people? When you bring staff on, you bring physicians on, your intake tools, your assessment tools, et cetera, should really focus on their attitude toward regulation, toward following the rules, and their ability to actually do so. And one thing, I know you're small organizations, you pretty much know who's around, you kind of have a good handle on people because you work so closely together. But having some line staff and physicians respectively involved in the actual hiring and appointment decision-making process, and I'll explain why that's going to be important in a few minutes. And then obviously your technical work, your job descriptions, performance evals, appointment, reappointment, should build in what you expect in terms of attitude and their ability to actually comply. Last piece is opportunity. Cat in the cradle. I'd love to, Dad, if I can find the time. Time is the enemy. People, especially your medical staff, don't have the time to give, and especially in small organizations, the more that you take people away from the bedside, you have no one else to buffer and cover you. You're running pretty thin as it is. So the key here then is to flatten the bureaucracy. And one way for your docs is don't expect them to sit in committees, to sit in work groups. Let your staff and your administrative team do that work up front, and then simply go to them for decision making. So, and I'll give you an opportunity. For a while, the Joint Commission was very interested in assuring that physicians were part of an after action analysis for emergency preparedness testing. Wanted to make sure that there was a doc sitting there when you all analyzed how well your last emergency drill went. So what would hospitals do? They'd run around, they go, hey, Dr. Smith, we have a meeting next Tuesday from 1 to 2. Can you come and sit with us? We have to go through the analysis of what happened, et cetera. Maybe Dr. Smith was willing to give it a one shot. Half the time though, he says, I'm too busy, I've got too much to do, I'm sorry, I can't. If, however, the team had met and said, here's the 3 things that we think that would involve physicians, that we think we need their buy-in on, and then said to Dr. Smith, I need 2 minutes of your time. While we're working, while we're doing something, let me run these by you. That they can do, and they're still involved. You still meet the intent of whatever standard it applies to, but you're respecting their involvement in time. I surveyed a hospital once, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I surveyed a hospital once that had a QAPI program where the average manager spent 4.5, I'm not making this up, 4.5 hours a week simply sitting in meetings to discuss QAPI issues. And when I went to the CEO, and just for the fun of it, did a cost analysis, he was absolutely shocked. And I said, you've got a burgeoning bureaucracy here. What's your return on investment? So flattening that bureaucracy, making it as simple and linear as possible. All right, so that's engagement. Can we get back to culture now? Absolutely. 2 types of culture, formal and informal. The formal culture is what your organization propagates or postulates. That's your mission, vision, value statements, your policies, your codes of conduct, the orientation and training programs. That's all the formal things that you do to get a message across to your staff and physicians about your beliefs, the attitudes, the behaviors, etc., that you want to have a successful organization. And once that's done, then usually a staff person, for example, is turned over to someone on the floor to actually get oriented. And that person, if they go to your new hire and say, let me show you how it's really done, then you're in trouble. Because the informal culture, that peer-to-peer behavior modeling, is what actually sustains and builds your culture from the bottom up. So if your formal culture and your informal culture aren't in alignment with each other, I guarantee you that informal culture that exists in the line structure of your organization will emulate the behaviors that will either succeed or fail you when it comes time for surveys or just about anything else. So I'll give you 2 stories about the disconnects. This one deals with radiology and informed consent. Serving a hospital once looking at the patient who had gone to interventional radiology, did not find a consent form on the chart. I looked at it, the director of quality for the hospital looked at it, we tore through the chart 3 different times. There was simply no consent form, which of course is an issue. Later that day, the radiology supervisor had sent a little note into our conference room that basically said, oh, understand that you were trying to find the consent form. It's in the chart. It was there all the time. You must have missed it. And I looked at the quality director, and she's looking at me, and we're like, we didn't miss anything. She goes, no, we didn't. So we went back up to the floor, looked at the same chart. Sure enough, there, right, the very first page on the top of the chart is the consent form. And I said, okay, let's go down to radiology. So we go down to radiology, and essentially, long story short, we walk in and we see the radiology supervisor instructing her staff on how to lie to us should we question the legitimacy of the form, and this is their story and they're sticking to it. Later that afternoon, the CEO comes into our little area that they have set aside for us. He's apologizing profusely. This is not our culture. This is not what we value, yada, yada, yada. And I said, you know, I'll accept that you believe what your culture is, but let me just ask this question. If that is in fact your culture, how did your supervisor feel so comfortable to go in front of her staff and essentially engage them in an attempt to falsify information? I would respectfully submit that what you believe to be your formal culture and what your informal culture is are perhaps 2 different things. Conversely, when both informal and formal culture align, it can be a beautiful thing. Surveyed a hospital once and asked about the processes for reconciling medications. Patients come in with their home medications, you take the list, make sure what you're going to give and not give while they're there, et cetera, et cetera. And so I asked, how does this work? And they explained it to me. And then I said, so where would I find the documentation that the process occurred? And they said, you won't. And I said, well, what do you mean? They said, it's a behavioral expectation. You'll see the list, but there's nothing that says that I reconciled, and there was actually no requirement for that. I said, well, if it's not documented, how do you know your folks are doing it? He said, and the CNO said, ask anybody. Ask any staff member, ask any physician. They'll tell you exactly how it's done. And I said, okay, well, we'll see how well that works. So for 3 days, I ran around asking every nurse, every physician, everybody I could meet, walk me through how you reconcile. What's the process? Every single one of them were completely aligned, consistent with the policy. And I went back through and I got to the exit conference for the hospital, and I simply sang their praises. And I said, you know, I tried to poke a hole in it, and I couldn't. The policy and the behavior align completely. Formal and informal culture. So simple truth, you can establish the culture as leaders from the top down, but it's going to be your staff that sustain it from the bottom up. So how do you establish the formal culture? Pretty straightforward. We do this all the time. Our value statements, our policies. Little thing on policies that might help you. You cannot be cited for failing to meet your own performance expectations. You can be cited for failing to follow a policy. Now, I'll give you an example. If you look at most accreditation or CMS standards and requirements, there's an expectation that an initial nursing assessment would be completed no more than 24 hours after a patient was admitted. Now, I don't know too many clinicians that would sit there and look me in the eye and say taking up to 24 hours to do an initial assessment is good nursing care. So what do? We write policies depending on the setting and that sort of thing as to how quickly we expect these assessments to occur. Then when a surveyor comes in, finds that you didn't make that time frame, you're cited not because you violated a standard, but because you violated your own policy. But if your policy had said that our policy is that we must, in this example, have an initial nursing assessment within 24 hours of admission, but our performance standard is that we get it done within this time frame. Then failure to meet it means you didn't meet your own performance standard, and you can take action on that, but you didn't violate your policy, and therefore I have no basis to cite you. So that's something to consider. The other thing is, where appropriate, get policy out of the shared drive and the manuals and things to the actual point where the practice needs to occur. Very simple example. Surveyors love to run around to staff and say, hey, so how do you shut off that medical gas valve? If there's a leak and you have to shut off the valve, how do you do that? And we're expecting the staff person to be able to answer that. Rather than hoping they can remember the 1 in 5 million pieces of information that you cram down their throats in the months leading to survey, have a little sign right above the gas valve that says, if you have to shut off the valve, here's the 3 or 4 steps you take. I don't have to remember, I just need to go to the valve and say, this is what I do. Take an EVS worker that has hazardous chemicals on their cart, and they're questioned about the safety data sheets and how do you get those and what do you do if there's a spill. Rather than having to remember where to go and get those, consider looking at what they have in their carts, pulling the SBSs, making copies, put them in a little protector, and have them attached right to the cart, maybe English on one side and their native language on the other side. All the individual has to remember is to look at the card and read it, rather than trying to remember stuff. So you get things out to where they actually do care, and that's getting that formal piece of your culture a better chance of being inculcated than simply having to rely on memory. Job descriptions, compensation structures, metrics, all of that stuff is helping you to get your paperwork in order. Speaking of paperwork, this blew me away. I read a study once by Salsus Global that the average healthcare worker on a daily basis has over 600 policies, procedures, or guidelines that impact the care, treatment, or service they provide. How in the world can we expect folks to do things consistently, appropriately, and reproducibly when we are completely inundating them with the technical and the formal culture of the organization? So if there any way that you can streamline, modify, simplify the sheer amount of paperwork and things that they have to understand, the better the chance of your formal culture taking hold. Get the right leaders. This one is probably the one thing that I'm gonna, one of the two things that I think is really important. We often, now in small hospitals, I'll admit that sometimes you're bringing people from within and there's not a large pool. So you already pretty much know your people if you're grooming from within. Sometimes though, you're having them from without, and that's where you have your intake processes to try to screen them as best you can. But the key here is to recognize that just because someone was a good clinician doesn't mean that they're going to be an effective leader. Those are different skill sets. I'm a nurse by background. My training was in trauma and critical care. And I would consider myself to be a fairly good clinician, but I'm not going to pretend that I was the greatest clinician that ever worked in the trauma unit. I was competent, I was solid, but I certainly wasn't the be all and end all. But what I found is I had a knack for understanding a regulation or some standard and how to interpret it, teach it, and apply it in a way that made common sense and got others to come along with me. But there was no place for me to go in that particular hospital because all the ladders, all the recognition, all the growth potential was around how good of a clinician were you, not how effective, in my case, of a regulatory compliance person Same concept goes for leaders. Simply recognize that, and you may be looking at people with a different skill set that can actually help you better. If you have the board, get the board on board as much as possible. Make sure they get the training, the education. I worked for a corporation that shall be nameless once. The quality committee of the board was made up of basically lay people, and our CMO would come into that board meeting with very complex graphs and charts, technical terms, jargon, and essentially befuddled the committee to where they sat there and said, okay, I really don't understand what you're saying, but I will trust you. You're the CMO. And some of the stuff that came through that committee, I would sit there and scratch my head. But training the board in a way that they can understand issues and act upon them. And then what I've seen effective in some organizations, both large and small, is the board actually out on the floors making periodic rounds. So maybe once every 6 months, you can talk a board member into, hey, let me show you the hospital. Let's tour, let's go to the areas. And not just the lobby and the med surg floor, but take them into the OR, take them to sterile processing, take them in the back of the kitchen, let them see how that works, and let them get that real world experience of what they're hearing in the paperwork and all of that stuff. Likewise, this I thought was a great program. It was a small hospital, not a large staff, small C-suite, but the CEO essentially every quarter would have the C-suite go out and spend the day working alongside a line position. So the CFO would spend the day in the kitchen making trays. The VP of the foundation would spend the day with nursing and an aide cleaning and turning rooms over and all that kind of stuff. And what it did is it helped the leaders understand the effect of the policies and the budgets and all the decisions they made on that front line. And the front line saw the behaviors that the leaders wanted to be emulated from the leaders themselves. The unintended consequence was that leaders got to know their staff and vice versa. So the CEO would be walking down the hospital and a lab tech would be coming, a phlebotomist would be coming the other way. And in the past, when it was, hi, good morning, now it was, oh, Emily, good to see you. Are the kids, is your son feeling better? He was, and oh, thank you for remembering, because they actually had a connection, and getting people out to do that is a really great way to get that formal culture. All right, informal culture. This one is something that is, I would encourage you to take home with you. The reality is, as leaders, you cannot maintain the informal culture of an organization. It's out of your purview. It's out of your ability to control. The best you can do is try to influence that culture so that it aligns as close as possible with the type of culture you are wanting to have emulated. And the first piece here is to recognize probably the biggest lie that we have been told in healthcare. And that is that 80% of the performance issues that we see in our hospitals are because our processes are faulty. That is a lie. The reality is that 20% of your people are causing 80% of your problems. And we need to get to the point where we stop constantly changing our processes and we get to where we start identifying the 20% and either help them improve or help them find a new career. And I will give you the classic example. There is a universal protocol. If you're a clinician, you know about this. It's to prevent wrong site surgeries or procedures. That protocol, if you implement it as it is designed, it is foolproof. They have engineered through the use of that protocol the possibility of error right out from under us. If you follow that protocol, you will not have a wrong site surgery or a wrong procedure. Yet, it is still one of the top sentinel events that occur in hospitals across the nation. Why? Because every single time the investigation is done, the protocol wasn't followed. So is that a performance issue caused by a faulty process? Or is that a performance issue caused by people not following what is a well-designed process? So if that's the case, you need to determine and realize that your aggregate data will not change individual behavior, but data that addresses individual behavior will aggregate to change your culture. I remember as a staff nurse early in my career, our manager would come to us and they say, we're not doing well on this, and we're not doing well on that. We need to improve this. And we'd all sit in the room, and I'd sit there and go, actually, I know exactly which nurses aren't doing that. I work with them every day. Simply telling all of us that we need to improve doesn't change a thing. Pull the 3 nurses in and sit them down and say, hey, you got to do this. How do you do that? That's by doing prevalence studies rather than random sampling. So rather than saying, I want to go see how my staff is doing with pain meds or medication administration or wherever it might be, you simply find several nurses, pinpoint them, look at their stuff. If they're fine, find a few more until you find the ones that aren't doing it, and then you can sit them down, help them, educate them, get them up to speed. And if that doesn't work, then you basically say, maybe you need to find a new career. Make your story, stick to it. It takes 50 to 20 times before something that you say to someone becomes internalized. So every single way you can reinforce your culture and what you expect. Everything from having it show up when you turn a computer on, the signage. One thing I really would recommend is that you groom your right people. Remember, if you give your orientations, you turn them over to a proctor or a mentor or preceptor. If that preceptor doesn't adhere and have the same values as the formal culture, that's where you'll lose your people. So taking the time to make sure that your preceptors aren't just clinically knowledgeable, but also have the right attitude and the right aptitude to engage those new people, be they staff or physicians, to do the right thing. Very cute. I saw in the back of a bathroom once, a little place where they had a bulletin board and all sorts of stuff for the staff to know and read. And they were supposed to sign that they had read all the stuff. And I just went out and said, that's an interesting process. What do you think of it from an infection control standpoint? They didn't have a good answer for me. So carrot and stick, basically, if someone's doing the right thing, celebrate it. If they are willfully and intentionally not exhibiting the behaviors that you need to have, then punish that. And by punishing, I mean suspend, get them out of the organization. I am not talking about not following just culture. People often make mistakes. We're human. You try to help people, grow them, etc. But if you find someone that essentially simply isn't willing to follow the rules, you have to move to get them out of the organization, because they will be toxic to the culture that you're trying to establish for the rest of the staff. Consider creating choke points. Choke point is where you cannot have a patient proceed through care unless it's an emergency until critical quality and safety issues have been addressed. Does the record contain all the documentation that we need? Have any quality control activities occurred that have to occur? Were they done correctly? If there's a high-risk process of care, that's where you deploy those. It takes buy-in from physicians and it takes buy-in from staff, but if you can create these choke points to where you say the patient doesn't progress until we've established that we are compliant to the regulations at that point in time, that will really help you establish that informal culture, because people get used to it as just the normal way of doing business. Obviously, again, if it's an urgent or emergent situation, you don't try to do this, but where you can, having that process really, really helps. Last thing I'm going to leave you with is just something to think about. Change is necessary often to get a culture established. For many people, change can mean loss. And understanding what it means to experience loss, believe it or not, is critical to understanding how to move people in a way that will change your culture. And if you're familiar with Kubler-Ross, I'm going to give you a classic example and you'll see what I mean. There was a time where the universal protocol for wrong site surgery was changed. And the change required that the practitioner performing the procedure would mark the site of the procedure. And so hospitals took this to their medical staffs and said, hey, guess what? You now have to mark the site. And the first response in many instances where that can't be correct, you must have read it wrong, show me the regulation. So you'd have to bring the actual regulation to them and you'd show it to them, and the response then was, this is ridiculous, I'm tired of accrediting agencies or CMS telling us how to do our business. They shouldn't be getting involved in the clinical management of healthcare. The anger came out. And then a few days later, a doctor would come in and say, hey, how about if I have my assistant mark the site? Is that going to be okay? Could I have that happen? They start bargaining. And then when you tell them, no, it's got to be you, then you'd often see them walking around, sulking a bit, muttering about how dumb this is and how they hate this and blah, blah, blah. And then one day, the practitioner turns and says, can you get me the pen? And they mark the site and they accept the change. That is a classic Kubler-Ross mechanism of handling change. Why bring this up at the conclusion of a presentation? Because if you don't understand where your people are in that process of when you change something and they lose something because of it, you're not going to know how to approach them. And that is about it. I don't know if we have time for questions, but if we do, I'm happy to entertain them.
Thank you, Rick. If you have any questions regarding today's topic, please feel free to email Rick at rcurtis@CIHQ or Allison Orwig, your Indiana Rural Healthcare Association representative.